So it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Peter Sai-wing Ho, who was a member of this department for almost 30 years or just about 30 years? 34. Okay, I stand corrected. And served as chair for cumulatively 13 years, I believe, in that time, plus or minus. During that time, he helped steer the department through turbulences and growth and all kinds of crises that we don't even remember, and that's probably a good thing. I fear he probably does remember, but wishes he didn't necessarily. And he was instrumental in shaping its current vision and its pluralist heterodox department that we are. That emphasizes critical analysis and the history of ideas. We are all, and I have to say this both personally and as a department, indebted to Peter for the strong foundation beneath our department that we got to inherit, and particularly those of us, Yavuz and myself, that have been chair since him. He is Professor Emeritus in economics here at the University of Denver, and his research interests broadly lie in trade and development, and that's the two courses that he used to teach continuously, although I have learned during one of his many open office hours that he taught very many courses in his 34 years here at the he is also affiliated with the Core China Research Program at the Universidad de Navarra in Spain. He is on the editorial board of Bulletin of History of Economic Thought, and at the Institute of Economics at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Apart from journal articles, he has published a book, Rethinking Trade and Commercial Policy and Theories, and perhaps more importantly, he is working on his second book now, and I believe the talk is material from that effort. That book is titled Industrial Development and Division of Labor, A History of Analysis, and will be published with Cambridge University Press. So with that, please give a warm welcome to Peter Ho.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is really great to be back at the U. I want to first of all thank Markus for a very kind introduction. Thank you to everyone in the department for inviting me to come back here to give this talk. So the title of today's talk is Projected. And it's a slight variation of the book manuscript that I've been working on. I left out division of labor, and I tried to put in the word telling history of analysis with the hope of getting a stronger, bigger audience. And it seems that it is working a little bit, but I hope I don't disappoint. So for a while, I've been reflecting on the long history of the industrial policy debate. And I want to talk about it a little bit today. And the latest round of this debate started at about the onset of the Great Recession, 2007, 2008. And the number of books and articles that have been published on that subject since then is simply phenomenal. So I have only put a few images of, 5 books in the upper portion of the slide. And toward the end of March, I got an email from the IMF saying that too much industrial policy can be harmful. When you get that kind of email, you look at food label on cereal boxes, soy sauce bottles to make sure that you are not taking in too much industrial policy every day. And we need to remember that some variants of this debate have been waged for over 2 centuries. And when a debate remains unsettled for that long, one wonders if the current round is simply rehashing old arguments. Is there anything new? Has the debate advanced in some sense, or is it stuck? And so my hope was that through an examination of this long history of the debate and the different arguments that have been provided by the different sides, I could find a way to sort and organize the main arguments to help me and those who are interested in this debate to decide what is new. Is there anything new? Or are there things that are new, but actually are simply repackaged from the past and are being recycled? So when I received the invitation to this event several months ago, the full title you saw earlier, then about a week ago, Markus told me that I would have only between 30 to 45 minutes. So I have revised the subtitle. Instead of a telling history, it's now a truncated history. Now, I should not throw the chair under the bus because I have been the chair for 13 years. I know how bad it could make one feel. But more seriously, later on at different points, I would indicate, okay, here's a truncation. And if anyone is interested in further details, I would be more than happy to get back to those details during the Q&A. So what is industrial policy? Now, examples do not constitute definitions, but I believe that a couple of quick examples could serve to provide a hint of what an industrial policy is about. So, in the immediate post-war period, there was an intense debate in Japan on the path of its economic development. Economists at the Bank of Japan reportedly advocated simply following the conventional free trade doctrines, in which case Japan would specialize in producing and exporting textiles and certain kinds of food products. Others, among them the engineers at the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, often known as MITI, thought Japan should perhaps aim at competing in the auto industry and in products that involve what in those days was referred to as the transistor technology. Special steps, policies should be employed to encourage and support those sectors. Now, if you fast forward to the 1992 presidential election in the United States, where Bush was seeking re-election and ran against Bill Clinton and Ross Perot. Among other things, Clinton had proposed offering support to develop certain high-tech industries. In expressing this disapproval, Bush economic advisor Michael Boskin reportedly remarked rhetorically, and I think here a slide would dramatize it, computer chips, potato chips, what's the difference? Okay, it's funny, but you get the idea. Now, talking about chips, the Chips and Science Act was signed into law by President Biden a little over 9 months ago. Supposedly, it would provide roughly $280 billion in new funding to boost domestic research and manufacturing of semiconductors in the United States. Now, again, examples do not equate to definitions. I personally do not think that a policy should only target one industry. Now, it's a reminder that how we delineate what an industry is a tricky thing to do. There are good reasons to consider broadening support for to non-industrial sectors. So toward the end of this talk, I hope I can convey something that is a bit broader. Now, the history of analysis that I was hoping to discuss concerns how economists have portrayed production in the analytical frameworks that are brought to bear as they debate on this subject. Interestingly, in the current round of this debate, there are two participants. And I am sure that you are familiar with at least one of them. Now, this is the screenshot of the title page or part of the title page of one of the articles by Hajun Chang and Antonio Andreoni. So in two separate articles, although I'm showing only one at this point, I'll show the other one shortly. They have called for bringing production back into development, meaning bringing production back into the study of development. Now, many of you, maybe I should say all of you in this room, based on my interaction and conversation and from hearing what Markus was saying in his introduction, you know a lot about economics. And so we might wonder, well, isn't production occurring in all economies? And as a result, isn't production always present in economic analysis? So why would someone have to say, bring production back into the study of something? Now, it would become clear what they are trying to get at shortly. But in the meantime, let's have a couple of quick reminders of how most economists look at production. Some of you may recognize this diagram. Those of you who have taken international economics, linear production possibility frontier. So labor is the only input. And then you have the neoclassical trade model with curved production possibility frontier. Now, this is between the previous slide and this one is a truncated part of history. That process was not simple to move from one to the other. Now, of course, these diagrams have their familiar mathematical counterparts. So you have diagrams, you have mathematical functions. So economists have incorporated production. Now, but these are drastically simplified. And simplification or abstraction, there are sometimes good reasons for them, and there are advantages. And here it focuses attention on the benefits of specialization and trade. So to simplify the argument, a less developed country that is considering an industrial policy to try to industrialize, and let's say that country does not have industries, an argument could be made, no, you don't need to do that because you could specialize in agricultural products or extractive products, trade with the other country, and then you get whatever you want. EVs, smartphones, all those goodies you don't need to make yourself. So there is simplification to drive home the point, to make it stark, to make it obvious that specialization in trade would get you. And indeed, there was a famous economist at the University of Minnesota that said, yeah, that's oversimplifying things on the production side. It gives you those advantages. And one additional dramatization that I added is with the specialization and trade that follows, everyone in both countries could live happily ever after. Now, let's go back to why Chang and Andreoni are making the call to bring production back in. And here I'm showing a screenshot of the second article where they issue that call. Now here you see in the title, not just bringing production, but also employment. And they make reference to Alice Emerson and pay tribute to her legacies for development studies. Now, if you pay attention to Alice Emerson, so it was Alice Emerson who earlier, so these two articles by Chang and Andreoni, was one in 2017 and the other in 2021. They were referring to Alice Emerson's 1997 article, which is this one. And now the projection cut off something, but if you look at the lower left side, Professor Emerson is referring to Adam Smith. So what she wrote, and that's the opening sentence of this article. Smith's theory of economic development, that a surplus above subsistence derives from innovative divisions of labor, constrained by market size, is firmly and fundamentally rooted in production. Now, then she starts to refer to the pin factory. Now, I'm sure you have all read a bit about the pin factory. So here's the pin factory. How is the treatment portrayal of production different compared with what we saw earlier, those production possibility frontiers? Now here, there are certain kinds of details that are left out in the other description. I'm not going to read the description here by Smith, but you know what kind of details I'm referring to. Now, I should take this opportunity to clarify that details are not necessarily useful. So I'm not saying that simplification is necessarily not a good idea and providing details is necessarily a good thing. The key question, of course, is what kind of details? Are those useful, pertinent details for what you are trying to analyze? So what could be the advantages of having some of these details? Now, of course, Smith was trying to drive home the point that it is with division of labor that we could improve the productive powers of labor. Now, so I've included a couple of passages from the Wealth of Nations to illustrate that point. And then there is also, as you remember, the note that division of labor is limited by the extent of the market. Now, but if that is all that there is to be gained, it is possible that those that I was trying to say, oh, they were simplifying things too much, they could retort and say, okay, we can draw diagrams, we can come up with mathematical formulas to capture the decrease in average cost of production. Certainly that can be done. Indeed, that has been. But Smith has more to offer. Now, so we are getting into something that is a bit more complicated. So, let's see here. Yep. So there is this consideration of the relationship between division of labor and how inventions could be induced. Now, you will notice that at some point I am switching between inventions and innovation. For now, I'm sticking with invention. So he said in one of these passages, a great part of the machines made use of in manufactures were originally the inventions of common workmen, who being each of them employed in some very simple operation naturally turned their thoughts towards finding out easier and readier methods of performing it. Now, so this is one way in which the division of labor could induce, could prompt some sort of invention. Now, but there is another way, another mode. So many improvements in machinery have been made by the ingenuity of the makers of the machines, when to make them became the business of a peculiar trade, and some by philosophers, whose trade it is not to do anything but to observe everything, and who upon the account are often capable of combining together the powers of the most distant and dissimilar objects. Now, this is more difficult to draw diagrams to represent or to come up with mathematical functions to capture. And I have more to say about this later on, because one thing I want you to start thinking about, okay, today don't a lot of economists talk about R&D? Now, one thing that I want you to pay attention to is when you read about people who emphasize R&D, do they just talk about R&D, or do they root and relate R&D to some production? Can R&D be detached from production? Now, but we'll get back to those issues later. So, I think I'm still okay. Now, so there are two modes of invention here. And now, I'm not saying that these are the only two ways in which inventions can be made. No, I did not say that. And I'm not saying that all the time they can be sharply distinguished. Well, they often work in tandem. So I just want to make that clear. Now, so division of labor improves the productive power of labor, and then you have these wonderful things. So it all sounds very good right now, but then Smith said, wait a minute. The scope for division of labor differs across sectors. Now I want to take a quick look at this, where I highlighted in red, the nature of agriculture does not admit of so many subdivisions of labor as manufacturers. This is perhaps the reason why the improvement of the productive powers of labor in this art does not always keep pace with their improvements in manufacturers. Now, there are problems with this passage because how is manufacture defined? How is agriculture defined? what in manufacture are you talking about? So I admit that there are ambiguities, but the thing that I want to take from this is there's path dependence. Depending on what you specialize in, the opportunities for you to learn would be different. Now think back to the slide where I have the two kinds of chips. With all due respect to potato farmers, there is learning to be done in potato farming. So I'm not denying, but are you freaking kidding me? That other kind of chips, I mean, there's a lot more to learn. In fact, it is with the help of that kind of chips and put them in a John Deere, let a potato farmer use that John Deere, it makes the life of the potato farmer much easier. Okay, so there's path dependence. Opportunities to learn are different. Now, that draws our attention to the question of how the fruits from division of labor might be distributed. I start with a passage where Smith said, with division of labor, there could be universal opulence, which extends itself to the lowest ranks of the people. Now, when he wrote this, it was within a certain country, a certain economy. Now, I played with some words and I posed the question in smaller prints. Will the great multiplication of the production of all the different arts in consequence of the global division of labor occasion a universal opulence which extends itself to the lowest ranks of the less developed countries? An important question. Now, earlier I dramatized with a certain treatment of production, everyone in both countries live happily ever after. But when we think in the other, using the other approach, I am, to put it mildly, not so sure. Put it mildly. Earlier, we had lunch at an Indian restaurant and we tended to go mild. So stick with that, mild. Now, in the case of Smith, you can add up some of his arguments and you say, hey, I mean, everything points to uneven development. Division of labor is limited by the extent of the market, differs across sectors. Foreign trade can extend the market, extends room for division of labor. And he also said something which in today's terminology is, well, there are differences in income elasticity of demand. So if you specialize in potatoes and I specialize in smartphones, there would be quite different development trajectories. Now, I want to quickly indicate to you two economists who otherwise we think, oh, they believe in the simplified production and they also advocate the free trade and specialization because everyone can live happily ever after. One is Stanley Jevons. Now, this is an interesting passage. Unfettered commerce, vindicated by our political economists and founded on the material basis of our co-resources. This is taken not from the book that is Theory of Political Economy, which some of you have read. It is from the co-question. Has made the several quarters of the globe our willing tributaries. Now, our refers to Britons. The plains of North America and Russia are our cornfields. Chicago and Odessa, our granaries. Canada and the Baltic are our timber forest. Australasia contains our sheep farms. And in South America are our herds of oxen. Peru sends the silver, and the gold of California and Australia flows to London. The Chinese grow tea for us, and our coffee, sugar, and spice plantations are in all the Indies. Spain and France are our vineyards, and the Mediterranean our fruit garden. I wish he had pointed out Italy could also be part of the vineyards. And our cotton grounds, which formerly occupied the southern United States, are now everywhere in the warm regions of the earth. Marshall is another person that you have read a bit about. Now, these two passages are not taken from his Principles, which is the book that most often people would read. So by applying the law of increasing return to production on a large scale, England made the whole world tributary to her wants. The more America exported her raw produce in return for manufactures, the less the benefit she got from the law of increasing return. Now, let's pause for a moment. So if there is uneven development, one might take the next step and say, hey, you know, that might be a reason to think about designing some sort of industrial policy to help those that are trailing in the development process to catch up. So instead of making potato chips, you find out ways, okay, what can be done to prepare yourself to make other kinds of chips? I mean, we all love potato chips, okay? I mean, no one disagrees. But now, it is possible for another retort. Then John Stuart Mill offer an infant industry case for trade protection. Now, here are some extracts from that endorsement passage where Mill offered that endorsement. So for lacking present superiority of acquired skill and experience, a young and rising country which has this skill and experience yet to acquire may harbor hopes of naturalizing a foreign industry. Protecting duties can then be defensible when they are imposed temporarily until the producers in that new and young country have been educated up to the level of those with whom the processes are traditional. Now, so I've been setting up this talk so far as back and forth arguments. So it seems like every time we think we have a case, the other side would come back with something. Now, indeed, Mr. Mill offered this case for trade protection. And what could be the response? Now, before we respond, I want to fast forward a little bit to see why this is important, because in many rounds of the debate, including the current round, this is an important contribution by some economists. So I draw your attention to a more recent article, this one from 2006. by two economists, Howard Pack and Kamal Saji. Is there a case for industrial policy, a critical survey? Now, in there, they said, indeed, the infant industry argument for trade protection anticipates most of the rationales for industrial policy. It's a precursor of the modern arguments. And that's when economists focus on this concept that is called market failures. And it's a concept that you are all familiar with. So they say, wait a minute, yeah, there could be uneven development, but let's analyze the situation. It's all because of different kinds of market failures. So yes, when you have market failures, there may be a reason to introduce policies. And so industrial policies, it may be cool because you are just dealing with market failures. Now, I need to press on a little bit faster, and there would be more truncation as I go along. So I want to next ask the question, is market failure an adequate, useful concept when it comes to looking at underdevelopment, looking at uneven development? Now, it would be a quick solution if we say, oh, well, you know, say Bangladesh, let's use that as an example for me, is lacking in development. No, that's because of market failures. Let's think about what policies would correct those market failures, and then voila, Bangladesh would surpass South Korea or whatever other country you might want to name. Is it that simple? Now, I turn my attention to some articles that are more critical of the notion of market failure. Now, I don't mean to suggest that these are arguments that have been worked out adequately, but they are good for food for thought. So I want to go through some of these. This is one that is rather long, and I want to emphasize the credentials of who put this together. Now, there's one author that is at the bottom, Cimoli. Some of you are familiar with Giovanni Dossi, who is another author, Richard Nelson, Joseph Stiglitz. So they were all voicing doubts about market failures. They are not saying that it is not useful altogether, but they are saying that we need more. We need something more. They by themselves are not going to cut it. Now, so the second bullet, they even say most often the demand for proofs of failure mainly plays as a device to put the burden of the evidence away from the believers in the dogma that in general more market is always better than less. Now, I then looked at, let's see, Christopher Freeman. Some of you are familiar with him. He is typically recognized as one of the key figures who was involved in conceptualizing what is known as the national system of innovation. He especially tried to point out that Friedrich List, who otherwise is known as a protectionist, who is less articulate than John Stuart Mill, but he said it's a huge mistake to boil the debate down to free trade versus protection. And then going back to Ellis Amsden, look at the second paragraph. It is not the case that economic development is an unqualified process of reducing market failures. In terms of production, it is a process of building and buttressing them. And then there is Richard Nelson. Now, Richard Nelson had, the next slide shows a working paper titled, Building Effective Innovation Systems versus Dealing with Market Failures as Ways of Thinking about Technology Policy. Even though this is a working paper on the slide, it was subsequently published as a chapter in a book. And then there is Arrow, who has talked about learning by doing. Now, it turns out that what Arrow actually wrote has been a bit misapplied. The first paragraph is usually what people take from Arrow. Learning is the product of experience. Learning can only take place through the attempt to solve a problem, and therefore only takes place during activity. So the more you try to do the same thing, the better you are at it, and the average cost goes down. Now, but then actually in the next paragraph in the same article, he said, learning associated with repetition of essentially the same problem is subject to sharply diminishing returns. Now think about if you have to learn to do the same thing over and over and over and over again. What is going to happen? There is an equilibrium response pattern for any given stimulus toward which the behavior of the learner tends with repetition. To have steadily increasing performance implies that the stimulus situations must themselves be steadily evolving rather than merely repeating. Now, so learning by doing has been, as a notion, as a concept, I think has been abused. It's not that simple. So earlier, I talked about Adam Smith thinking about inventions in two modes. So there is a Danish economist by the name of Lundvall. So Chris Freeman, Richard Nelson, and Lundvall, of course, are the key figures in the literature on national system of innovation. The first mode of learning, Professor Lundvall, he notes that this scenario involves learning by doing, using, and interacting. And Lundvall abbreviates it as DUI learning. Now, that's a questionable abbreviation. Okay, but you get the point. Learning by doing, using, and interacting. Or in short, experience-based learning. The other kind of learning, the one that involves the philosopher who does nothing but to observe things, he calls it science-based learning. And he abbreviates it as STI, science, technology, and innovation. Now, that brings me to a point where I just want to quickly describe to you what can be done and what further research can perhaps focus on, so that I can save a bit of time for Q&A. So if you remember, I started with drawing your attention to the fact that some economists have issued a call to bring production back. And then I said, okay, how have economists treated production? I dramatized it, simplified it. Some economists do it in a simplified way, but again, with the understanding that abstraction is not necessarily a bad thing. We all need to do it. But then in Smith's portrayal of division of operations, certain details are important. Might some of those details be providing the important context for the learning? Now, indeed, if I continue with Professor Lundvall, look at the second paragraph. The structure of production as reflected in the division of labor between and within firms is at the very core of the innovation system, since it constitutes a materialized context for interactive learning. Now, if you don't refer to what a country is producing, it is hard to just say, hey, go spend more money on R&D. Now, in some sense, if you think a bit about card games, now, actually, for those of you who know Mahjong, it's better to understand in terms of Mahjong, but that's for dinner. We can save it for dinner. If you have not signed up for dinner, that's an incentive for you. History deals a hand of cards to these less developed countries. They inherit certain production structure. That is the initial materialized context for possible interactive learning. Now, I said possible because I mean, the fact that you are in a learning context does not mean that you are learning. You may not be learning, but you may be. So you are dealt that hand of cards. Now, if I push the analogy a bit further, and I don't hope to push it too far, what is the card game that is being played? Who is playing it, and who are the players that you are playing against? Now, the game that I'm trying to steer you into thinking about is, are there ways to change that initial hand of cards that you are dealt, and in the process, enrich the opportunities that you learn? Now, there are multiple ways of making that happen, but they have different pros and cons, and sometimes it is not possible to decide until you have landed in the context of a particular country. So some could say do import substitution. You could invite multinational corporations to come and undertake foreign direct investment and hope that in the process you can soak up a bit of the technology, different ways. And that's what I meant by possibly changing the initial hand of cards that you are dealt. Now, had time allowed, I would actually go a bit more into when you change that hands, what perhaps could happen. But I want to make a couple more remarks, and I want to save a bit of time for Q&A. Unfortunately, not all methods of changing the hand of cards would be allowed, because there are all kinds of multilateral, plurilateral, or bilateral agreements that have been signed. Now, I know what has happened in the last year or so has made things very complicated, because the WTO is in shambles. what can or cannot be tolerated by those countries that are advanced. It is no longer just economics, or maybe it was never just economics to begin with. And so if you relate to what's going on between the United States and China, the Chinese very aggressively changed the initial hand cards that they were dealt. You change too fast and to our disadvantage. But it's not just the Chinese. Now, some of us are from that generation, but some of you need to go back into history and look at the relationship between the United States and Japan in the 1980s and early 1990s. They were economic rivals, and there were lots of saber rattling between the two countries. So maybe the United States just doesn't like the fact that any country is economically catching up. It doesn't matter whether you are an ally or an adversary. No, it cannot happen. India, it has already received some attention. And in the 70s, South Korea and Taiwan, they were scolded on certain occasions. Now, but when you think about, and one thing I did not bring out as much as I would like to, although some of you may have caught that term in some of the slides, is the word institution. So it is not just so much just a matter of what government policy we want to consider in the debate on these policies to help the less developed countries to catch up. Institutions are very important. R&D departments were not introduced by Great Britain. It was by Germany, as Germany was catching up. And so what institutions might countries come up with in the process of catching up, so that between the policies and institutions, now let's not forget, we are here at an institution of higher education, some departments or units of which are doing research that directly relate to technological development. We are part of the picture. Now, those of you especially who have studied abroad, you would get a sense of how the institutions of higher educations are different in other countries. Some of them, there are lots of catching up they need to do. At lunch, before lunch, we were meeting with a couple of graduate students. China, the colleges and universities are of very, very different qualities. You hear about Peking University, oh, that's a great university. But then there are lots of mediocre institutions. So, in this country, you have all kinds of labs, research labs. What do other countries have? Now, so one thing that I did not have time to bring out is, in addition to policies, there are those institutions. The reason I want to end on that note is because earlier, Madison introduced, it was you who introduced Professor Foster. Your name again? Jordan, yes, sorry, Jordan. Professor Foster and some other institutionalists were very much interested in the relationship between institutions and technology. And I thought that to honor him at this moment, I should add that, and then I want to leave it to Q&A. Thank you.